Severns. I work as a digital strategist or a creative strategist for Roundarch, which is a digital agency out of Chicago. And today we're going to talk about movement, social movements. And I have Ream here, who is she's a founder of both Girl360.net, which is a tween empowerment and webzine, but she's also the founder of the Voices and Faces Project, which is a nonprofit national survivor network, and it's created to give voice and face to rape survivors. And I also have Alisa Roadcup, who is representing Amnesty International, USA's Women Human Rights Coordination Council, and she oversees their social media strategy, web development, campaign messaging, and membership, all in support of their efforts. So, special treat, we're going to talk about movement, and want to talk first about before Twitter and Facebook and all digital existed, there was, social movements going on. So let's explore what is it that we can learn from that time? Like what can we learn about the movements and the connection to that time?
I think one of the really fascinating things that people lose when they think about social movements historically is how strategic some of the most powerful social movements actually were. And there's this sense when you follow history that they emerged organically or spontaneously, and yet when you get to know movements and history a little bit better, a great example would be Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. The decision for her to be the spokesperson for that movement was not spontaneous. It was a decision made because she'd be a powerful and compelling face for the movement, that she had a personal history that would actually reflect well on the goals of civil rights. And so the NAACP really chose her, and in fact didn't choose a handful of other folks who were willing to make a similar statement. And we lose that in our assessment of history, and yet I think what it tells us about social movements is even way back before we were talking about marketing strategy, or we were talking about strategy, people were strategists. Which is one of the things that I think is really fascinating, and that we can learn that the perception and the fact that it was strategic doesn't in any way reflect or say that it wasn't real, that it wasn't important, that it doesn't matter. Strategy is actually necessary in social movements as much as it can sometimes be something people don't want to nod to.
Well, I love this question about old school social movements because it requires us to think about the distinction of old school and new school or social media. And I think we have a responsibility to have awareness of the history of social movements, to be informed about what kind of tactics were utilized, what was the strategy that was implemented at that particular moment in history that was right for that moment. And I love the reference to the civil rights movement. And in my work with Amnesty International, we recently took on a case of a gentleman named Troy Davis. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this case. It was ultimately heartbreaking, but what happened with an Amnesty is that on an historic level, our membership began to mobilize around the story of an individual who was sentenced to execution. And what happened and what we saw was this integration of old school methods of social protest, like marching. In Atlanta, the night before his execution, there was a march down to Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta and a prayer vigil on his behalf. And in all my years of working with Amnesty, I'd never seen individuals come together in a spiritual space to pray in my work with Amnesty. But aside from that, 600,000 petitions were taken to the Georgia Board of Paroles and Pardons and delivered on the front doorsteps. So there was a very much an old school way of protest and bringing awareness to this issue, while at the same time people were going crazy, hundreds of thousands of people taking action online through Amnesty's website. So I think that we have a responsibility to be aware of the history of social movements and to apply those in a culturally and contextually relevant way when it comes to our marketing around social justice issues.
There's also, I think that's such a powerful example, because the one constant in social movements that have been compelling and effective is stories. You know, that people can understand social justice issues in some ways the very same way that we understand individual experience or brands or products, but they don't mean anything to us too often until they're connected to a personal story. So long before, the fascinating opportunity with a case like that, I think, is how do you take a very heartbreaking, specific story about one individual and find a way to say to the world, this story is a symbol of something greater and larger, and it has to encourage us to act on behalf of all people's stories that look and feel like this. And that's always I think, whenever you're storytelling, you know, our project is a documentary project, and a lot of what we try to do is get the issue of sexual violence and trafficking to feel real, to make those statistics and facts real and compelling by finding voices and faces that make that real. But the challenge always is to pull people away from fixating too much on a single story, and to use a single story to pull people back, you know, to pull people back so they can look more broadly. And that is a strategic challenge.
So what about, in just quickly, in practical terms, how has digital changed how we've approached that?
I mean, when I think of digital, I think two of the challenges that I think are most significant with storytelling is the accessibility of the stories. What does it mean? What would it have meant in the 60s, for example, to share the story of a victim of sexual violence in Ebenezer Baptist Church? Would be an interesting example. Someone to stand up and give testimony, versus what it is like now, what it was like now for our documentary project to see these stories go online, and to know that women in regions where historically there's a far greater level of oppression, where women risk their lives if they're talking about sexual violence and torture, they're seeing these stories online. They're exposed to these stories digitally in a way that compels them to act. But what are our ethical obligations in terms of knowing that the stories we're telling in the United States have global implications? So I think one of the first really critical questions that for me the rise of digital media and social media, at least in terms of documentary and social justice work, begged, is what are the ethical implications of the work we're doing, and how do we navigate around that? And then the second challenge that I think is really, I especially think this is critical with, for example, Twitter, but an awful lot of social media, I would say this is true for. It needs to create conversation. It cannot be the end of the conversation. And that's really critical.
So speaking of your brands, the kind of the gravitas of what your brands in particular deal with can be very overwhelming to a person. So how do you deal with keeping that approachable, but also engaging people and getting them excited about what you're talking about?
Sure. I always think about the term compassion fatigue when I'm presented with this question, and it's something that we always come up against because we see thousands and thousands of images of suffering every day, and so we have a tendency to tune out or to become numb to this. So there is a very sort of important and sensitive way to bring issues of human rights to the public fore in a way that is approachable and not overwhelming, like you were saying. So many times if you'll look at Amnesty's website, we'll have a very graphic image of a human rights violation, like the image of the man in his underwear with his hands tied behind his back, blindfolded, standing on a box. The images of the people at Abu Ghraib who were tortured. These are images that were spread throughout the media, and they're at the forefront of our mind. We all know what that image looks like. And those kinds of images that can be overwhelming need to be tempered with images of humanity. So we implement a lot of up-close facial imagery, hands touching, hands clasping, and present this issue of violence or injustice or torture in ways that are very clear and honest and direct in terms of what we're trying to do, but we use imagery very strategically because photos and images and art can give language to the unspeakable, and I think that's it's a way that we're able to navigate those sensitivities.
So strategically, and I think you both have talked about this a little bit, but when a brand is very strategic about what they're doing in their social movement, it can come across as really staged and almost manipulative in a way. So how do you approach that subject, and how do you keep that public trust going with how do you incorporate strategy without compromising that public trust then?
I mean, that's always a really important question for documentarians in general. How close do you get to the story? Is the story purely authentic, and are you outside of it, or are you looking at the story and already anticipating the impact of the story on the culture, and in fact, in some ways, inserting yourself and your ideology into that space? And I think what I've seen repeatedly is that people have a much higher awareness of, the general public has a much higher awareness of authenticity than we think they do. And that there is a sense, there's sort of an inherent pushback when you see imagery. I mean, Susan Sontag wrote about this in really powerful ways. When you see imagery that's incredibly devastating and painful, the Abu Ghraib images, it's actually a really powerful example. Part of what happens is they're so horrifying that there can be an instinctive response in people to say that can't be authentic. That can't be occurring in the world that I live in. And I think part of what we have to be able to do is share those images and those stories in the context of broader facts and data and statistics and broader information that makes clear to people who are exposed to that imagery that this is real, that this is about something real and global. So you take away that tendency to doubt. And then I think, one of the biggest challenges is, and this does dovetail with some of the challenges and risk of storytelling in a digital world, is that you're constantly with some of these stories, and Alisa's alluding to this, balancing the need for truth against the need for hope. Because if I see this story and this truth is so painful and feels so insurmountable that I don't think it can ever be altered, why would I act? And yet, and you also have to recognize when you're telling stories like that as much as they're calling the general culture to action, there are also stories that other victims are exposed to. So what does it feel like? We ask ourselves a lot on our project when we're sharing the stories of sexual violence victims and trafficking victims. What does it feel like for someone who's just lived through this violence to be exposed to that story, if what that story says to her is, I'll never get over this, right, or this has permanently altered my world? So I think the whole process of conveying these messages demands that you're hyper-conscious every step of the way, and that when you make choices that create risk, or when you make a choice to be a part of a movement where people can get hurt, that you know what the risks are, that you don't pretend the risks don't exist.
And Anne, to your point of storytelling, and with Amnesty International, and this also goes back to the initial question of how has digital media transformed the way we communicate. So Amnesty was founded 50 years ago, and our annual letter writing campaign, many people would have thought that it would have fallen off the face of the earth by this point, because who does snail mail anymore, right? But every year, consistently, and for the month of December right now, we're gearing up for our annual letter writing campaign, and it's a very successful way of bringing a way for individuals to engage directly, but then also social media has enabled people to take action on human rights in real time. So what used to take 2 weeks or more for a letter to go from the US to Argentina now is done digitally. So social media has transformed the way that human rights is able to come to the fore of social awareness.
It's perfect music that ending. I hoped we'd had time for questions, but if you have any questions, either tweet to one of us or some of you out there can come talk to us afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you.